In this video, we're going to take a look at Callifolio Olivastre. Let's jump straight to the end with my opinion. This is a solid performing green with really good tone variation by Nib and really good shading. I can see this ink and many other of the Callifolio inks up on my shelf when I eventually get into the bottle buying mood. There's no reason not to. They perform so well, so many of them. They're all just so well behaved. An ink like this, where the shading goes in and out of its darker tones so frequently, really does add a lot to the simple ideas that I'm putting down. I think even my transcribing some of the book in this ink makes it look like I have more of an idea of what I'm talking about. I do love math, and I do love math history, but I'm rereading and learning so much, and I see it in colors like this and makes me really happy and even motivates me to completely copy this book in one ink color just because I think it would be so good to have. It's just a personal nerdy thing. When you see a color like this, it makes you want to keep writing. So it could make you a bit wordy, and maybe we'll call that something to be a little weary of if you're already wordy in the beginning. I like to change things up by using a different pen each day. Today that pen is a Pelikan M205, the Duo Highlighter with a double broad nib. It's inked up, used for a day, and used to take the notes for this video. To see how I arrived at that opinion, let's take a look at the first writing sample done on Clairfontaine. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. We get some decent shading, and I'm going to call it decent here because this is a drier writing fine, and being a drier writing fine, you get more of the shading. It's just that everything that's going on is lighter in tone. But if you look at the word save, where it goes darker to lighter to darker, or himself, where it phases in and out of dark tones quite frequently, it really does make it look very nice. Now, a little bit later, you're going to see the word himself gets thicker, and for a very brief moment, there was something caught in the nib. And in a single word, the flow of this ink cleaned that piece of debris out. The medium is darker than the fine with no feather, no spread, really good shading. I think the tone looks really good here. The broad nib is slightly darker than the medium, with no feather, no spread, still really good shading, really nice on the page. Looking at the back of the page, we get no real ghosting, very minor, and no bleed through. To have a range of experience with this ink, all of the writing samples are done with a Kaweco brass sport with a fine nib, a Pilot vanishing point with a medium nib, a Nimicine fission with a broad nib, The next writing sample is done on Leuchtterm 1917 paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, we get no spread. We do get some shading, although it's much darker in general than we saw on the Clairfontaine. And that is partially due to the tone of this paper, where that cream tone is bringing out more of those darker tones and making it look really good. The medium is much darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread, really good shading throughout all of its writing. It's look at how thoughts, where it gets just a bit lighter at the U or quite a bit darker at the TS. I really do appreciate that in some inks. The broad nib has no feather, no spread, still has some shading because the tone itself is a little bit darker than what we get in the medium. So while it's overall a little bit darker, when it shades to some lovely, very dark spots, like the E in Since on the top line. Looking at the back of the page, we see a normal amount of ghosting and we get no bleeding. I agree with Vita. There's a lot to learn by doing multiple chromatographies. The next writing sample is done on Moleskine paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, fairly good shading on this more absorbent paper. It looks really good and is again a bit darker than what we had with the Clairefontaine. It's looking really good right here. Now, the medium, the most noticeable thing you're going to see starting out is that little pencil mark. That pencil mark is a bleed through spot that had occurred with the previous page, and it's only that tiny spot, just so that we don't get hung up on that. The medium is a little bit darker than the fine. It has no feather, no spread. It does shade fairly well. When I say it's a little bit darker, it's only the tiniest bit darker than the fine. It's beautiful right here. The broad nib is about the same tone as the medium, just more of those darker tones. With no feather, no spread, less shading than we saw in the medium, although we still have a few spots of it. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we get very minor ghosting and no bleed through. Resistance tests are done to see how this ink can be expected to perform on the page, and more importantly, how hard it may be to clean from your pen. This smear is allowed to dry for 3 days before testing it. And here we see the results of the resistance test. The next writing sample is done in a composition notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread, very little shading. There are a couple spots, but not really so much. This paper doesn't always really let those qualities show through. It does still show as a very easy, pleasant green on this paper. The medium is only the tiniest bit darker than the fine, with no feather, no spread. I think the shading is showing up much better. You see the H in where, or where. You see in everybody where it goes from lighter to darker to lighter to darker. It is very nice here. Really like how this is looking on this paper. The broad nib is a little bit darker than the medium with no feather, no spread, not as much shading, but it still does shade very well. Look at the word like, how the KE gets very dark. So when the shading comes through in the broad, it looks really good. It's just very sparse on when it shows up. Looking at the back of the page, you see minimal ghosting, really not too bad, and we get no bleed through. With over 1,000 inks reviewed, let's take a look at some color comparables. Here is Ackerman number 28. Here is Diatramentis Pine Green. Here is KWZ Green number 5. Here is Noodler's Texas Live Oak. The next writing sample is done in a Mead 5-star notebook. Looking at the fine nib, we get no feather, no spread. This paper truly does really well. This is the 5-star, and it's just a Mead notebook. I'm really very surprised by it, but as long as your paper is not made in America, usually it does quite a bit better. It does have a little bit of shading that comes through in this, and I say a little bit because it is truly just a little bit. Mostly what we're getting here is a good solid green. The medium nib is a little bit darker than the fine with no feather, no spread. I think the shading shows itself just a little bit better here than it did in the fine, though it's not like it's shading much more. I just think it shows up better. The broad nib is just a little bit darker than the medium. It has tiny feathers that you will see all the way through Descartes, all the way through Desire. all the way through just about every letter, but all of the feathering is very tiny and not such a big deal. There is a little bit of spread, but the spread that occurs is minimal itself. It's doing very well here, and there are a few moments of shading. Looking at the back of the page, you see a normal amount of ghosting, and none of these spots that look very deep actually bled through and touched the page underneath. While it's nice to find other inks in the same color family, I'd prefer to find an ink that complements its color on the page. Here is a gray ink by Diamine Graphite. Here's a brown shimmering ink by Jane, their 1670 anniversary Caroube de Chypre. Here is a black ink by Pelikan Edelstein Onyx. Here is an orange ink by Robert Oster, their Tangerine. If you'd prefer different complement colors, then there's links to those different playlists down in the description. Or you can click on my face. That'll take you to my channel page. Then click on the playlist tab. Scrolling down, you'll be able to see all of the playlists that are here on the channel. The last writing sample is done on 20-pound copy paper. Looking at the fine nib, we get feathering, as you would expect, but it's really tiny and truly very under control. We do get a little bit of spread, but again, this is very controlled for on this paper. We don't really get any shading, just a dark green. Now, the medium is on a majority a little bit lighter than what we got with the fine. We do get some feathering, tiny feathering the whole way through. We do get some spread, rather manageable. It's not all the way up to a broad. We actually get a little bit of shade spots that come through, which on this paper always worries me. The broad nib is darker than the medium. It has feathering all over it, but well, it's not bad. I find it gross on this page, but it's really not very bad. It does spread some. It's definitely wider than a broad normally is, and there's no real shading, so there's some hope, I guess, that it doesn't bleed. Looking at the back of the page, we see that we did get bleed spots that occurred on the broad and on the medium, but not on the fine. So a couple of these spots, it does bleed through and touch the page underneath, but only tiny little spots. The ghosting's normal. So what nib and pen do I think is going to give the best writing experience with this ink? When I'm looking at how this writes, a wet broad gives much darker tones with really good shading, and you can see it when I was writing with the double broad for the pen review that should be coming shortly, or has just come out, one of them. It shades really well from that, but I just don't care for the tone as much. It's not that it's bad, it's just not for me. For me, I really like how it looked from a medium flow medium or a medium flow fine. The dry fine was not a tone that I really care for. I find that the tone that I get with those is really good, and it allows the shading to really show itself, which I always appreciate seeing in my writing. Thanks for watching.